So this was touched on a whole bunch in that video. They drew their magic little triangles and pyramids and all that good stuff. So the balancing point or the fulcrum on a forklift is located in the center of the front drive wheels. So that is, it's where it turns, and it's also where it's going to tip or fall over if you have it overloaded. If too much weight is on the forks, there's a potential to tip forward, losing steering control and stability. And that's one of the biggest problems with overloading is your back wheels come off the ground just enough that you have no ability to steer. An excellent example of exceeding the forklift's capacity and the fulcrum effect. The forklift tips forward, losing stability and steering control. Of course, if this is happening, you need to reconsider your load, find a bigger forklift. To fight the urge to just put people on the back, that was the solution back in the day. It's not really a good solution now. I've sat on the back of and been a party to putting other people on the back, but no, that's bad. People are not counterweights, they're human beings. This is 2024, we can do better, and that's why we have bigger forklifts. So static stability, and I know this is on a test as well, what the difference is or which one's which. Static stability is the stability when the forklift is stationary, often said to be in a state of static equilibrium, and dynamic stability involves stability when the forklift is in motion. So that's the big one. If things are moving, it's dynamic because that's when everything shifts, and it's just like you'll feel when you stop a car, you feel yourself going forward. When you turn a corner, it pulls you to the side. It's all the same things happening to the load of the forklift. It's important to know the difference between the two as it greatly influences stability. There are 3 points of contact that make up the stability triangle. 1 point for the pivot pin in the middle of the steering axle, and 1 point for each of the front tires. I'm pretty sure this is also on the test. So that makes your nice little stability triangle. The BC line, or the front tires, is the fulcrum point, so that's where you're going to tip, and the forklift center of gravity should be maintained inside the stability triangle. Of course, you can't see the magic ball floating around, but you can definitely feel it. The forklift center of gravity shifts forward towards the front of the forklift, or the fulcrum point, so when you don't have a load on, the stability is at the back, closer to the counterweight, and once you put a load on, that center of gravity is going to move forward, and if it crosses that line, that's when you're going to tip. If the load exceeds the capacity, the center of gravity will extend beyond the fulcrum, and the forklift will tip over. On an incline, the forklift center of gravity shifts to the side of the forklift with the lowest tire. And that's something to consider too when you have pneumatic tires. If your tire pressures aren't correct, it'll actually cause it to sit off at an angle. And while that might not matter much in your car or your truck, when you're carrying 5,000 pounds of stuff or you're lifting it 10 feet in the air, that kind of shit matters. So if all of a sudden you're off to the side just a little bit, well, it's magnified by the distance or the height. So now that little tip to the left is going to be a whole lot of tip to the left when you put that load 20 feet in the air. The center of gravity travels outside the lines, the forklift will tip over. When we lift loads, the center of gravity moves up inside the pyramid, and that's the main thing to consider. It's not just a triangle, it's actually a pyramid. So as you get closer to the top, the triangle gets smaller and smaller, and it'll take less and less to make the forklift tip over. Again, as you saw in the video, if you've got your mast all the way up, it's incredibly unstable, and sharp motions, quick stops, quick starts, all that stuff will potentially cause it to tip over, tipping into a rut in the ground, which of course we have no ruts in our yard. Our yard is smooth as silk. Something to consider. Center of gravity has less room to maneuver within the forklift or without the forklift becoming unstable. So always keep your loads as close to the ground as you can. Consider the pendulum effect of objects in motion. As the forklift moves, the pendulum swings inside the pyramid. If the pendulum swings outside the stability pyramid, the forklift becomes unstable and may tip over. So the mass of your load, the height of your load, all that good stuff, and the speed at which you're moving will affect the way that center of gravity shifts based on the pendulum effect. And that's when you'll start to go up on one, lift a tire off the ground going around a corner or something to that effect. The following factors affect stability: the load dimensions, so the size of the load, the load center, height and weight, the center of gravity within the forklift itself, any operating surfaces. So we do have bumps around the buildings. We have low spots in the yard. There are a few, there's not much for hills and big deals, but there are some changes of grade. There's definitely potholes in the yard, soft spots. As you raise the load, there's less maneuvering room inside the pyramid. So your maximum capacity gets lower as you go higher. The mast must be vertical, so that is straight up and down. The vehicle must be stopped, and the vehicle must be level. So if you're on an angle or an incline and your mast is tilted to boot, again, that tilt might not be very much when you're on the ground, but once you put that mast out 20, 30 feet, all of a sudden that tilt becomes pretty significant. Don't travel with the mast elevated. Travel with the load as low to the ground as safely possible. This will allow for maximum capacity and stability. We'll get into how to run racks later on, but you don't want to drive around with the forks that high in the air ever. It's pretty unstable. Be mindful of the load you're actually picking up and how it's going to be affected by the action of picking it up. Only stable loads within the capacity of the forklift should be handled. The barrels are a good visual example of what can happen if your forks are too narrow or too far apart. Depending on what you're picking up, things will flex and bend. If you have to pick up something that's stacked together, make sure it's interlocked or put some wrap around it. Even if you're just driving something across the yard from building 2 to building 1, it's never a bad idea to throw a few wraps of stretch wrap around it to secure it. Securing equipment and materials. If a worker may be injured, if equipment or material is dislodged, removed, spilled, or damaged, both the employer and the worker must take all reasonable steps to ensure the equipment or material is contained, restrained, or protected to eliminate potential danger. So again, wrap your loads with stretch wrap. If you have to, use a ratchet strap to tie your load to the forks. If you're carrying cylinders like an oxyacetylene bottles or something, strap them to the forks. Whatever you have to do to make sure it's not going to tip over when you stop or start or turn or hit a bump. Follow the basic steps of spread the forks to lift the load. So basically make sure your forks are as wide as they can be for the load that you're handling. Enter the load with the forks level, square, and below the top of the pallet. Forks should be at least 2/3 the length of the load. That makes sure that most of the load is on the fork and not hanging off the forks. If you have a problem with that, use fork extensions. Lift the load straight up and tilt the mast back to secure the load against the heel of the forks. It's also just a good practice if you tilt the mast back so that when you're driving forward and you stop, things are less prone to want to slide off the end, especially in the winter. One thing to consider around here is we do a lot of moving in the winter. In the winter, everything is cold, everything is icy, everything is slippery. You have cold, icy forks, cold, icy material. Everything wants to slide. One thing you'll see in our JHAs for handling materials is a good trick you can use on a few of our forklifts is to actually use the fork positioner to secure the forks inside the fork pockets. You can put them in and either extend them out sideways or clamp them shut, and that will kind of hold the object you're lifting with the forks to make it less prone to want to slide off. We're also looking at putting grip tape on the forks, but we haven't got there yet because it's still summer. When handling long or high loads, watch the clearances and handle with care. These loads reduce stability, capacity, and visibility. Turning a wide load puts extra force on the side-to-side stability, so check and make sure you check your overhead clearances. You don't want to smash the load into anything above you. When traveling with the load, it's important to keep the load as low as possible to the floor or grade. So generally on flat surfaces, your load should be 10 to 15 centimeters or 4 to 6 inches off the floor, and that'll be the bottom of your load. So if you lift the pallet up, it needs to be the gap between the pallet and the ground or the floor. And on rough terrain surfaces, load should be raised 30 to 40 centimeters or 12 to 16 inches. My general rule of thumb is don't run around with your forks at nut height. And yes, nut height's different for everybody, and obviously mine's lower than Scott's. But either way, we don't want to be jabbing someone in the midsection with the forks. Don't drive with your forks this high. Put your forks down. Be mindful of the ground conditions. There are a few spots out there where you have to lift your forks up. Otherwise, you will drive your forks into the ground. But a good forklift operator should be basically considering that while they're driving and be adjusting the height of your load based on where you're driving. There's that dip outside assembly where the drain is. That's a notorious spot where if your forks are too low, you will jam your forks into the concrete. That little tiny hill beside the Quonset here at the corner, a lot of people skid loads off the ground going up or down that. Lift your fork, lift it up when you go over it, and put them down when you're done. It's you have to operate in real time. You can't just set your forks at 2 feet and drive around the whole site. You have to be on top of things and consider where you are and what's around you and adjust your height accordingly. So really, they can suggest all the dimensions they want, but you're going to have to adjust it for where you are and what you're doing and what you're carrying. Sometimes your forks if you're hooking stands, you might have to lift your forks higher to get the bottom of the stands off the ground. That's fine. It just all depends on what you're loading or what you're moving and where you're moving it to. Fork positions and pallets. Pallets should be squared into the heel of the forks. Anytime you can get your load right up against the heel of the fork, the better. Forks should be level with the floor or tilted to secure. Just a few visual examples of all the problems you can have with your forks when you're going into a pallet. Most of our forks are even. We don't have, I think the big boy has one slightly bent fork, but it's not very drastic. Other than that, all the other forklifts are pretty good. Obviously, if you don't go far enough into your pallet, it could fall off the end. If you're too low, you're going to skid. You're going to skid the bottom of the fork into the pallet, potentially push the pallet or damage the pallet. If you're too high, you're going to run into whatever's on top of the pallet. If you're sloping up and you've got your tilted, you could potentially rip apart the top part of the pallet with your forks. Likewise, if you're sloping down. So it's all a fine dance of just making sure that your forks are right for the load you're lifting. And again, if you need a second set of eyes, the Nissan that Assembly has is actually really hard to see through the mast. I don't know if it's better for tall folks. I know for midgets like myself, it's fucking hard to see those forks. That mast is a triplex mast, so there's 3 pieces, so it goes really, really high. But when it comes down, there's a lot of steel and cables you have to look through, and it is really hard to see those forks. They're short forks, and unless you're really tall and you can see the tips, it can be hard to see what you're doing with those forks. So if you have to get a second person to say, yeah, you're good, or lift up a little, tilt forward a little, whatever it might be, don't hesitate to do that. If you're struggling, don't struggle for too long. Ask for assistance. Most of the other ones are a little easier to see, but it can be problematic, and that's different for every person. But I know that one's notoriously hard to see through because it's a very busy mast. Extra care should be taken when loading and unloading in racks. Clearances are small, and in the event of damaging a rack, the results can be catastrophic, as we saw with that video at the very beginning. When racks are really, really solid when they're vertical like this, but when you put 10,000 pounds on top and you bang this and you bend this piece of aluminum, it's not strong anymore. It's going to crumple and it's going to fall. Racks are the same thing. They're really strong when they're in mid-condition. The second they start getting too bent, too dinged, too whatever, it could just take one more little bump and that whole thing could come collapsing down. It's not remotely as strong as they look if they're not in perfect condition. Ensure you always shoulder check 180 degrees before reversing out of the rack. For sure, look behind you. Always look in the direction of travel. It's a helpful thing when you're driving. Follow the 8 steps to load and unload racks. So it's going to walk us through the process of loading and unloading a rack. If you've never worked with racks, Rufus, have you worked with racks before, putting things in racks with forklifts or out? Mostly just driving around and yeah. So just because you take this course doesn't mean you're qualified to do it. Make sure, communicate with if you are asked to put things in racks, get a second set of eyes, get some practice. Don't just, I'm good, and go grab a pallet and jam it in the racks. It's people think, I'm good, I've been taught. Yeah, but you haven't done it, and that's the big difference. I can help you pass the course. I cannot make you a competent operator. I can make you qualified, but you won't be competent until you've done it. I'm a qualified millwright. I'm not a competent millwright. I'm a qualified millwright. There's a distinct difference. Scott has more experience doing that shit than I do. But the millwrighting. No, I'm just making a joke about my level of actual working on the tools. Yeah. But it's true. I'm certified, but it doesn't mean I'm competent. I know that, but somebody else doesn't know that. When you're done this course, you're certified. That doesn't mean you're competent. Don't just go doing things you don't feel comfortable doing. Stop. Ask. No, Allie would never fault you, neither would Jacob. Hey, I've never done this. Can you give me a hand? Absolutely. They'll find someone to help you out. We're all looking out for each other here, and we don't want to put you in a position where you're doing something that you're not comfortable doing, especially when you're working with a rack and you could potentially make a big mess, hurt yourself or others. So just make sure you communicate. So it's going to run us through the steps of loading a rack, and then reverses, or unloading is opposite. Follow these steps for loading and unloading racks. Your load should be square with your forks. Pretty straightforward. Reduce your speed as you get close to the empty rack so you don't go barreling into it at full speed. Turn your forklift so it's square with the rack. Make sure your mast is in the vertical position. Keep in mind the rear swing of the forklift. That's one of the biggest things to get used to in forklifts, is when you turn that wheel, it's the ass end that moves. And a lot of people have trouble getting used to that when they first start. And they move really fast, and they are really heavy, and they can do a lot of damage. So be mindful of where the rear end is and what's behind you. Raise the load a little higher than the empty rack, which is watch the top clearance. That's a huge one. Just because your pallet or whatever is above the beam you're putting it on, you got to make sure you're not hitting something on top, because obviously height matters as well. And if you're not sure and you can't see, get a second set of eyes. In my younger days, I worked in warehouses and was a maniac on a forklift and was super comfortable doing anything at any height, didn't give a shit. In my older days, now that I don't do it very much and my eyes are getting shittier, I am not remotely as comfortable putting things in racks as I used to be, and I will always get a second set of eyes because it's really hard to judge when you're 20 feet in the air if your forks are at the right height without bumping into things a few times to figure out when you get in the hole. All jokes aside, when in doubt, get a second set of eyes. It can be super awkward, and it's nice to have someone there guiding you in. With a reach type forklift, extend the load into the rack. So this is the ones where the forks actually go in and out. Obviously we don't have those, we're just using the sit downs. So on a sit down forklift, you want to drive forward slowly and make sure you still have your clearance space. This is where you also have to make sure your forks are perfectly level, because all those pictures they just showed us of what can happen if your forks aren't square and level. You don't want that happening 20 feet in the air. It can get really awkward. So it's important that everything is lined up properly. Lower the load until the pallet rests on the rack completely, and watch for short pallets that don't reach both beams in the rack. You might need to repalletize the load to a larger pallet. Our policy here is that we should be using a pallet that fits across the entire rack and sits on both beams. In most cases, we do have that wire mesh. That's just there as a safety factor. It's not really supposed to be holding the entire weight of the load, so make sure you're putting in pallets that fit the racks properly. Remove the forks by backing away with a sit down or retracting with a reach type, and lower the forks in maneuver at position. So the main thing is you want to pull up to your load or pull up to the rack, square up, lift up, put it in, back out, come down, and then drive away. Don't drive away when your forks are still 30 feet in the air, or lift your pallet while you're still driving towards the racks. Try to wait, try to get lined up, and then do everything as a nice order of operations so you're not rushing, and you can make sure everything's going to fit the way it should. It's a visual representation of all that. So you're square and level with your forks when entering and exiting the rack. Your sit-downs need wider aisles, obviously, because they turn much wider than a stand-up. Always be mindful of if you're tilting in the rack, because you might get this part out, but now you've lifted that up so you can catch the rack above. You got to watch your overhead clearance. If you were tilted forward, you could be damaging the rack. There's just a lot of things to worry about when you're doing this stuff. So again, if you don't feel comfortable, start off low. Don't make your first time putting something in a rack in the Quonset at the very top or in the assembly at the very top. Do something low, slow, start at the ground level, work your way up. The actual eye level ones can be the hardest because it's really hard to see what's going on. Stacking hazard. So when you're stacking one thing on top of the other, extra care must be taken when you're stacking loads. Ensure the bottom load can support the top load. So yeah, don't put something heavy on top of something light. That's just going to make your day awkward. Watch for height clearances when stacking. This is also true like if you're loading a truck or something. Ensure not to hit the bottom, so don't hit whatever you're stocking on top of. Don't run your forklift into that. Again, there's a few things to consider, and we will be doing some stacking for the practical test of just empty pallets, just to see how well you can maneuver things. Ensure the bottom load can support the new load. Maneuver the forklift square and level with the other load. Raise the load up a few inches above the stack. Watch for overhead obstacles such as ducts, pipes, wiring, and lights. Move the load over the stack by driving forward. Lower the load on top of the stack until the stack is supporting the weight. So you'll see your forks come away from the pallet or whatever you're lifting. Then you can retract or back up. Lower your forks to the ground or a few inches above the ground. And then you can drive away. Again, always try to make sure you're driving with the forks as low as reasonably practical. So there's just an example of kind of like the other one of what can go wrong. Again, if you're tilting forward or backwards, things start to be uneven and won't rest nicely on the other object. Make sure you know what's above you, and make sure what you're putting it on can support the mass of what you're putting in it. Docking hazards. This one always makes me laugh. All the hazards of docking. Many factors can complicate docking operations, including restricted space, driving with the load in reverse, driving over bridge plates or dock boards, and driving into and out of trailers or rail cars. Not something you're going to have to worry about doing here. We don't have any docks. But if you ever find yourself somewhere that does, make sure you familiarize yourself with the process. It can be a bit unnerving, and you have to make sure everything's in the right spot. The whole truck moves around while you're loading it. You got to make sure the truck is properly secured. There's a lot of things to worry about. Rail cars, before entering rail trailers, make sure the trailer brakes are applied and wheels are secured. Rail cars should have brakes set or wheel stops in place. Ensure the trailer bellies are fully lowered and secured. Fixed jacks can be necessary to support the trailer. Before you drive inside a trailer or rail car, make sure to check the floors for their strength. Make sure dock plates are properly anchored. Travel slowly on the dock plates. Dock plates have restricted space. Yeah, dock plates are narrower than the truck they fit into, So you have to consider how narrow that is. And then use lights to improve visibility. In the old days, they used to have lights mounted to the building that would light the trailer up. Now most forklifts come with lights. Depending on what you're doing, that can be very helpful. Just another visual example of what to consider and what can go wrong. Be aware of the overhead clearance, because obviously the truck has got a low ceiling. Use a dock plate when entering trailers. If you don't put a piece of plywood down, use a proper dock plate. Ensure the trailer is able to support the weight of the load. So either make sure this ground is secure and stable. Sometimes the trailer or the tractor will still be attached to the trailer. If that's the case, make sure the driver's not in the tractor, because having the truck drive away while you're inside it sucks. I think I had that happen once. It's very unnerving when the thing you're in starts to move. But again, not something you have to worry about here. If it was, there's some potential issues. Obviously, the floor was not strong enough in the one on the left. And it looks like the truck drove away with the one on the right, or rolled away. It's hard to say, but based on the fact you can't see the building, it's probably been driven away and then the driver rolled out the back, I guess. Either way, not something you want to have happen. Grades, ramps, and inclines. We have these here to a certain extent, but nothing drastic. While ascending or descending grades, avoid turning. Turning increases the likelihood of a tip over, as we saw in the video earlier on. Always ensure the load is secured or tilted back to the heel of the forks. When traveling loaded on grades, ensure the load is upgraded. So if you are driving up and down a ramp, you always want the load to be at the top of the ramp. So if that means you're backing up or down, so be it. So when you're empty, the load is the counterbalance on the forklift. So it's upgrade. Once you have a load on your forks, you keep that up the hill, and that's the right way to do it. Otherwise, things can become unbalanced and tip over. And there's just a visual example of how the center of gravity is affected by a grade. Attachments, so there's a ton of different attachments out there. We really don't have very many around here except for fork extensions. But different attachments will drastically affect the stability. It affects the stability of the forklift as the center of gravity is moved, creates a partially loaded condition, reduces the overall capacity and stability, and it must meet manufacturer specs and be certified by a professional engineer. So don't use attachments that were fabricated by the place you work, unless somehow they have engineers that are signing off on them. We don't, even though we have engineers, they don't sign off on forklift attachments. So we need to make sure anything we are using is store-bought, which usually proves it's safe in the instructions that go with it. We have the man basket here, the personnel basket, and we have fork extensions. That's about it. We do have a little crane that goes on the forklift, but it's buried in the back 40 of the yard, and we never use it for anything, but we do have one. Obviously, there's a whole shit ton of different things available. Some examples include the standard forks, tire forks, rams, plywood forks, which are super, super narrow and sharp on the tip for getting in between sheets of plywood, half forks, coil forks, and carpet forks, or carpet rams or whatever. The faster a forklift moves, the faster the center of gravity or pendulum will shift. So basically, it's always better to go slower. Turning corners at high speeds increases the likelihood of sideways instability, which if you've ever turned too sharply in a forklift, you can feel it sort of go off on 3 tires. It can be unnerving. And if you go too far, you can get 1 tire right off the ground. And if you push your luck a little more, it'll very easily flip right over, or at least fall over sideways. Due to extreme weight and velocity, forklifts obtain both kinetic and potential energy. The faster your forklift travels, the more distance you will need to stop. The higher you lift the load, the more potential energy it develops. Potential energy changes to kinetic energy, or the energy of motion. Kinetic energy is developed by motion. The steeper the grade, the faster the forklift will go. Icy and wet surfaces greatly affect the traction and braking of your forklift. That is an issue around here because we basically expect all of our forklifts to get used outside in the winter. Every forklift in the place, all the small counterbalances get chains, tire chains in the winter, except the Nissan in assembly, because the Nissan in assembly spends a large portion of its time in the building, and we don't want to have chains on the tires when we're driving it around inside the concrete building. So that one does not get chains, but that also means it does have to deal with slippery outside surfaces. So take that into consideration. There's gravel available, and better yet, there's bigger forklifts available that can handle it. Operators should consider the following factors: the clearances around the forklift, above, below, forks themselves, fork extensions, the load, the forklift design, and any grades you may have to travel on. When turning with a sit-down forklift like what we have, the pivot axis runs through the drive wheel axis. So this is something that's important to remember when we go out there and do that test. these things turn around that center wheel. So if you put that center wheel even with the corner, it will turn on a dime around that tire. It doesn't matter what the forks, doesn't matter what the back end, it's all going to shift and pivot on that axle. So consider that when you're doing the slalom and the serpentine stuff for the test. And then be mindful of the rear end, because the rear end swings out. It's big, it's heavy, and it moves really quick. So you kind of have to look forward and backward at all times, have your head on a swivel, and know where your rear end and your front end. And in saying that, you also have to be mindful of the pallet, or whatever you're carrying, where it's going to go. So if you're carrying anything odd or big or awkward, get a second person. Sometimes one thing that some people often forget with forklifts, you can lift over top of stuff. One of the most common things is someone struggling, and then all they really have to do is lift up and lift the thing above the object that you're struggling with and go over. But that being said, if you're doing that, be mindful of things around you and people, and then put it back down as soon as possible. But yes, one trick with forklifts is you can lift things up. So if you're struggling in a situation like this, if these walls were only a foot high, well, you could lift your load 2 feet high and go over top of the walls. As long as you're mindful and you're doing it and it's safe, it's the simplest way to get her out of a sticky situation. And then as soon as you're clear, you can put it back down. When conducting a turn, line the pivot axis at the point of your turn. So in the case of what we're going to do outside, you're going to have some caution or some pylons. Remember the turns on those front wheels and line the front wheels up with the pylons. And always watch the rear end swing. Stand-up lifts, I'm not going to go through detail with this because they're very different. And we don't have any, so it doesn't really apply. If you find yourself driving one, make sure you tell your new boss that you've never driven one, and they'll get you trained on that one. Pre-operational inspections. Operators are required by legislation to conduct pre-operational inspections before working with a forklift. That's why we do a pre-operational inspection every day and document any problems that occur. Inspection must be documented, as ours are. Checklists can be used for daily pre-operational inspections, and power mobile equipment must not be started if a visual inspection is not complete. So every department does theirs every morning, and if the inspector finds something wrong, you're going to take that unit out of service, or something safety issue, it's too big a deal, we will take it out of service and we won't use it. If it's something minor, like a damaged headlight or something, we're still going to use the machine. We don't need the headlights, at least this time of year. Follow these steps for startup. Assume the appropriate driving position, including engaging the operator restraint system, seatbelt. Ensure the handbrake is engaged and directional controls are in neutral. If they're not, it won't start. Usually the common problem if your forklift doesn't want to start is somebody left it in forward or reverse. So make sure it's in neutral. Start the engine, or turn the switch to the electric forklift on position, and monitor the gauges. It's important to use 3 points of contact when mounting and dismounting a forklift. Try to avoid the urge to jump out of the forklift to the ground. We've all done it. Try to maintain 3 points. So that's either 2 hands and a foot or 2 feet and a hand. Either way, take your time. Somewhere else, I swear it wasn't here, but I was rushing to get into a forklift and I put this foot on and I slipped and I ran my leg down the whole edge of that friggin' little lip, which gave me a wicked bruise and scrape all the way down my shin. It's not fun. It was slippery outside, and I was in a rush and wasn't paying attention. It's super easy to make these mistakes. We all like to turn out of the seat and hop to the ground. Same thing. If it's slippery, it's really easy to slide, and all of a sudden you wind up on your face. So just take your time and get out like a professional, not like a stunt driver. And actually, kudos to the stunt drivers in that video earlier. I wanted to point out they're the real heroes because man, the crazy shit those guys did, that was unreal. Yeah, but it did show you all the things that can go wrong. Always leave a forklift in a secure and safe position. Ensure the forklifts come to a complete stop before dismounting. Yeah, don't get out of your forklift while it's still moving. Place all controls in the neutral position and set the park brake. Lower the forks by tilting forward and then lowering to prevent tripping hazard. So, as we saw with a whole bunch of these pictures, the forks are tapered. So you actually want to tilt it forward and then lower it down so the taper is on the ground and the tip is as flat to the ground as it can be. If you just lower them straight down, you'll actually create a tripping hazard because the tip of the forks will end up being an inch or 2 off the ground. So just try to make sure you tilt forward a little bit and then lower your forks. Opposite of that, when you get in a forklift, you should pretty much always lift it up and tilt it back so your forks are level. Place all loads on the ground, never leave a load suspended. The only time we're allowed to leave a load suspended, and it's written into our documentation, is if we're wrapping the load. It's pretty hard to wrap a load without it being off the ground. So that's the only time we make an exception. Otherwise, we should not be leaving loads suspended just because. Never leave a forklift on a ramp, dock level, or in a trailer. Never block emergency exits. Remove the keys to prevent unauthorized use. We leave all our keys in our equipment overnight because it's in a building. In the event of a fire, we might want to get the equipment out of the building. The only time we take the keys out is the units we leave in the Quonsets and outside in the outbuildings. We take the keys out of those. Otherwise, the ones in the buildings, the keys stay in. But we do turn off the propane in all of our indoor forklifts at the end of the day. So whoever brings the forklift in should shut the key off and shut the propane off. Never leave the operator's position while suspending personnel on a fork not to work platform. It's going to tell us that about 9 more times. If you are ever involved in lifting a human being with the personnel basket, you are stuck in that seat until that person is out of that basket. Park the forklifts away from safety equipment, doorways, exits, pedestrian walkways, elevators, and ramps. Bring the forklift to a complete stop. Place all directional controls in neutral and set the park brake. Put the load engaging means or the forks to the fully lowered position. Shut the engine off, turn off the controls, and remove the key. If the truck must be left on an incline, block the wheels, and then turn off the fuel source. So most of that we're following every day when we bring our equipment inside. When you are refueling and recharging, propane gas or liquid propane gas, petroleum gas, extremely flammable and can cause an explosion. Flammable limits are 2.4 and 9.5% depending on the concentration. And LPG is heavier than air and will therefore seek the low-lying areas. So if there is a propane leak, it's going to go to the floor first and collect anywhere low, like the sumps. Normally found in a gaseous or vapor state, and then when it's compressed, it changes to a liquid. Boiling point is approximately minus 40 degrees, so unless you're on a really cold day outside, it's going to come out, it's going to go to gas at minus 40. But it can cause frostbite injuries, so if you crack a full tank and it sprays propane out, you'll notice everything gets frosty and white. That's because it's coming out so cold, and that can cause frostbite issues if your hands are there. So never hurts to wear gloves and just be mindful of those conditions. Chemicals are added to give it the distinctive skunk-like odor. Yeah, propane doesn't have a smell. They add mercaptan to it, which gives it the smell that we're used to. All the different parts of a propane cylinder. You got the cylinder itself, the walls, protective collar, the spit valve, fuel gauge, fill valve, locator pin, coupler, the maximum withdrawal valve, the shut-off valve, and the safety and relief valve. For when doing cylinder installation, follow your manufacturer specs. Don't change the cylinder around heat sources or open flames or someone smoking. Shut off the engine by closing the service valve and waiting for the engine to run out of fuel. 9 times out of 10, when we're switching out a fuel source around here, it's because the damn thing ran out of gas. Nobody ever is lucky enough to do it ahead of time, and it's always going to be as far away from the fuel as possible, which is pretty much Connor's every day, because it's all out by rentals, which is as far away as possible. But when it's out of gas or out of fuel, with the service valve closed, unscrew the coupler. So close the valve on the tank, unscrew the coupler, consult with the manufacturer's instructions for proper removal of tank. Ours are all pretty easy. You're going to unscrew it, pop the 2 straps, remove it, and then repeat the process to put the other one back in. Use proper lifting techniques and remove the cylinder from the bracket. So make sure you're lifting with your legs and your arms and not your back. Move the replacement cylinder safely to the forklift. Mount the cylinder on the forklift and make sure to line up the locator pin. It's pretty much the only way you can do it. If you didn't line it all up, nothing would fit and you wouldn't be able to get the supply lines on. Check the rubber seals on the coupler. Re-screw the coupler until tight. Open the service valve on full and slightly backseat. Don't get creative with those valves. Open and close the valves. You don't have to crank on them, open, closed, anything. Just open it till it stops and close it till it stops. That's how the valves are designed. You don't have to give it a little extra something. Just open and close it. Make sure both clamps are adjusted correctly and fully closed. They should just go right back. If you take a tank out, it should go right back in. You shouldn't have to adjust the straps. Make sure the cylinder doesn't extend beyond the running lines of the forklift, which it can't do if you've got everything lined up properly and in the locator pin. If no leaks are detected, start the forklift and refer to your SDS or safety data sheets if you're in doubt about the propane. If you're doing anything involving batteries, which we're not, the basic rundown of that are they're often lead acid baits. They come in a wide variety of sizes. Batteries are rated on amperes per hour they can deliver. and batteries should not be discharged below 20%. In most cases, there's going to be an alarm that sounds to make sure you don't run it right out. Only the correct size of battery should be installed. Sulfuric acid is the electrolyte used. The only electric battery thing we have is our scissor lift. And those batteries often get ignored, but usually maintained often enough. Batteries produce hydrogen and oxygen, so they must be charged in a well-ventilated area. The middle of assembly is a perfectly acceptable area. It's pretty big, which is where we charge the scissor lift. Remember, these batteries are very heavy, so use a hoisting device and appropriate controls. The scissor lift is basically a bunch of car batteries wired in series. The forklifts that they show us in this video are incredibly large batteries. In some cases, they're damn near as big as this table, but they're solid and they're full of sulfuric acid and stuff, so they're very, very heavy. And that's also why they count them as part of the counterweight, because they weigh 1,000 pounds. Battery maintenance. Proper maintenance will extend battery life. To clean corrosion, use baking soda and water. Check the water levels of the battery and use distilled water to top off. Ensure the head caps are tight. If you're charging a battery, follow manufacturer specs for PPE. Charge in a well-ventilated, non-smoking area, and that's because they create hydrogen and oxygen, which are both explosive gases. So you wouldn't want to fire up a dart and then go fix your or deal with your battery, because you might walk into a cloud of explosive gas. The reason this is all being reminded to us is someone has done that at some point in time and probably gotten burned or killed. So turn off your key switches and set the park brake. Don't wear watches or jewelry, as they may come in contact with the terminals, so anything that can arc out across the terminals and cause a spark. Disconnect the battery cable, and there's an example of those massive batteries that some units have. If you have to move batteries, use an approved hoist. Don't just rig something up yourself. Use the right tools. Ensure vent caps are secured. If charging in the forklift, ensure the battery compartments are left open. That's to let any gases that are created come out. Charger should be in the off position before it's attached. That's because if you have the charger in the on position and you plug the battery in, there's going to be a spark. Always read and follow the SPS. Gas and diesel refueling, which we don't have any gasoline here. We do have 3 diesel machines, the 2 big ones plus the Bobcat. Similar to that of a common automobile, might have a special filler cap or a screen. If it does, don't take it out. The refilling procedure includes following manufacturer specs, refueling the designated non-smoking area. Shut off the forklift, lower the forks, place the transmission at neutral, and set the park brake. Start refueling a tank. Be careful not to overfill. Clean up any spills. There's a spill kit by the fuel berm. Use only approved fuel and properly marked fuel cans, and always read and follow the SDS. General operator maintenance. Regular maintenance conducted by a qualified mechanical technician is required, and that's why we hire out someone outside to do it. But we can still check the fluids daily, ensure the tires are in good condition, visually inspect the fan belts, ensure light systems and alarms are working. Basic principles for forklift safety. There's 4 basic principles to forklift safety. They are: the mask must be down, good looks implying you must look around and know your surroundings, speed kills, and body safety, so be mindful of pinch points on the outside of the machine. Don't drive faster than you have to. Forklifts are not designed to travel with the mast elevated. Don't move with the mast elevated. Keep the forks as close to the ground as possible. These points will keep the forklift stable and allow for maximum capacity. Only good-looking operators should operate forklifts. That's their one played joke in this whole thing. Ensure you check 180 degrees before reversing. Always look in the direction of travel. And don't be distracted. Stay focused. No cell phones, food, etc. Yeah, if you're running a forklift, that's all you should be doing. For blind corners, follow these principles. Make sure you stop, sound your horn, look before turning, and use mirrors on the forklift and walls. Always proceed with caution. We don't have much for blind spots around here. The closest thing we have is in front of the quads. We do have mirrors that pretty much mitigated that problem. If you're out in the yard and you're driving around the racks, just have your wits about you. Keep your eyes open. You'll see other forklifts. Our yard is not that busy. If you're on a good day, there might be 2, maybe 3 machines working at any given time in that whole yard, and they're usually far away from each other. Other than Clayton speeding through at high speed, you really don't have to worry about very much up there. So yeah. So drive for the conditions. Make sure you're around pedestrians. Does anybody remember what the rule at LJ is when it comes to pedestrians in the yard? Who has the right of way?
Right away.
That's right. So when you're in the city streets of Edmonton, any fucker on the sidewalk who steps off, somehow he's got the right of way. You hit him with your car, he's covered. Well, admittedly, our yard is not as chaotic as the streets of Edmonton, but the onus is on the pedestrians to watch out for the big yellow forklift. If you don't see it, you're the one not paying attention. If you're out there with your cell phone doing this, being oblivious, and a forklift comes around a corner and hits you, whatever. That'll be for the law to figure out at the end of the day, but the reason we wrote the rule, or I wrote the rule like that, is because if you're walking in the yard, you can hear, you can see, you need to look out. The forklift operators are already operating. Now that's not to say that people operating out there don't pay attention and don't care, but still, at the end of the day, if you're walking around, you should be looking out for them more than they need to look out for you. And just do the usual. If you see a forklift operator, make eye contact, make sure they know you're there. Don't go right up close to the machine until they know you're there. Take the next aisle, take a wide circle, whatever you got to do. Nothing out there is moving that fast. It's not congested. There isn't 100 machines. It's not an Amazon warehouse.
Excuse that.
Yeah, buddy. So just have your wits about you. Body safety, keep all your body parts inside the running lines of the forklift, watch for pinch points, and keep others out of the kill zone, which is a 2-foot radius around the forklift. And they call it that because when you turn suddenly, that rear end swings out really fast. It could easily pinch a person between a wall and a forklift, or a rack and a forklift. So you always have to know, and that's why we don't want people sneaking up behind the forklift operator to scare them, because now all of a sudden they're in a dangerous place and the operator doesn't know they're there. So that's why the onus is on the person on the ground to show or to notify the forklift operator in the area. Tip over procedures. Make sure you have your seatbelt fastened to begin with. Don't jump out. It's kind of like an aircraft landing. You want to brace yourself. Hold tight to the steering wheel. Brace your feet. Lean away from the impact and lean forward. So grab the wheel and hold on tight and lean away from the direction of the fall. I mean, you might get a bit of a jar, or you might hurt your spine a bit, but at least you won't get crushed by the forklift. There's not a lot of opportunities to flip a forklift over. That's one thing LJ hasn't done, to the best of my knowledge, is had a forklift tip over. But you never know. Someone's going to be first, I guess. Personnel baskets. We do have one of these, and we do use it. Work platforms must be constructed and approved by a certified engineer and be large enough to contain the worker and their equipment. Work platforms include guardrails and tow boards to keep people inside and objects from falling out. You have a screener or barrier that prevents the worker from touching the drive mechanism or the mast, so you don't get your fingers wrapped up into cables. Scaffolds and temporary work platforms. As per OH&S, an employer must ensure that a work platform mounted on the forks of powered mobile equipment and intended to support a worker is commercially manufactured, or if not commercially manufactured, designed and certified by a professional engineer. Ours is commercially manufactured. We used to have a homemade one that got chopped up and thrown out. Now we have a store-bought one that's all legit and ties back to the carriage so it can't slide off. Forklift operators should never allow anyone to climb on the forks, carriage, or upright assembly to reach the work platform. Workers on a fork-mounted work platform should use travel restraint or fall arrest systems when working over 3 meters. So if you are involved in an operation that involves that platform, you can always review the JHA for it. Anybody who's working with you is going to be familiar with it because they have to have fall arrest, be tied off. So just make sure you ask the right questions, talk to your supervisor. Don't just go do it because someone told you to. Procedures for lifting workers on a fork-mounted work platform. Ensure the work platform complies with OH&S code and inspect according to manufacturer specs. Attach and secure the platform to the forklift, and that's a big one. There's a chain that attaches it to the forklift so it can't fall off. Position the empty platform in the work area on the ground nearby. Ensure the worker wears approved fall arrest system and anchors to the certified point. Ensure the platform gate is secure. Keep the platform level when you're raising it. Communicate with the worker being raised to avoid obstructions and crush points. Never leave the operator's position when the platform is raised. So if you are in the operator's seat and someone else is in the platform, you are stuck in that seat till that person's back on the ground. Never move the work platform horizontally while workers in it. So basically, you don't want to drive around the yard with somebody in the platform. You might have to move them a few feet to get them into the racking or something, but we're not going to just cruise around with them in there like a passenger. The employer must ensure the operator of the powered mobile equipment remains at the controls while the worker is on the work platform. The person must not be on a work platform while the powered mobile equipment is moving horizontally. There's this nice picture of things not to do. In my early days, this definitely happened. We used to have to change light bulbs in the warehouse, so we'd take a stack of pallets, somebody would stand on top and get lifted up to the ceiling and change the light bulbs. That's not going to fly anymore. That's totally wrong. We've got ladders on the top of trucks. Some guy who looks like he just climbed and shimmied up the post. There's a whole bunch of things going wrong. There's nobody in the seat of the forklift. So There's all kinds of things wrong with that. Don't be a party to any of that stuff. You're never going to get away with that around here anyway. People will see it. If you're working, in the event you're working somewhere that has elevators, make sure you get to know the rules of it. Obviously, we don't have those around here. Elevators should have a capacity plate certified by a professional engineer. I would fucking hope so. Don't ride in elevators that are homemade. If it doesn't have an engineered plate on it, don't ride in that elevator. Operators should know the capacity of the elevator, and remember the gross weight of the machine includes the operator itself, or the person, the machine, and the load. So if you're a small fellow weighing in at 350 pounds, you better include your weight in that lift. No, obviously. Of course. Hi, welcome to our little thing. Off you go. Go get a coffee. Follow these steps for operating in an elevator. Ensure the elevator floor is level with the building floor. Enter the elevator slowly and squarely with the load end forward. Shut the forklift down, lower the load, and shut the power off so you don't want to be in there with the engine running. Secure the doors and select the desired level. Start your forklift, raise and secure your load, shoulder check and watch for hazards as you exit. Again, all things that you'll have to refresh yourself with if you ever find yourself in a building that has an elevator for a forklift. Employers often have policies and procedures to ensure pedestrian safety. Operators should always operate with caution when working in pedestrian areas. Look in the direction of travel before moving and block off aisles where forklifts are operating. This is why when you go to Home Depot, they block off the aisles when they're running forklifts. Those poor fuckers have to worry about the public. We have the advantage of being a private company. It's only staff who are running around. But when you're at Home Depot and that guy's closing off the aisle so they can, and the aisle behind it to lift out that pallet of tiles, it's because of stuff like this. They have to protect the general public, and we all know the general public is stupid. So you have to go above, like they close off the aisle they're working in. They will often close off the aisle next aisle over. So if they were to push something and things were to fall on the next aisle, you don't have Tom over there buying some nails, having tiles falling on his head. So that's why they go to all these levels. They have flagging people and spotters, and it seems like a very grand, it looks like a big production, and you say to yourself, we don't do that shit at my work. Well, that's because your work is full of professionals, and their work is full of the public, and the public is the public. So it's Home Depot's responsibility to get that guy getting $18 an hour to take care of people who aren't being paid and haven't got a bloody clue what they're doing. There's some lady who's just trying to find something to fix her kitchen sink or something. So yeah, that's why they go to all that stuff in public places where they operate forklifts. Never allow any pedestrians to stand under the elevated forks. Pretty self-explanatory. Travel at safe speeds. Use the horn and other warning devices to warn pedestrians, and turn on all your hazards and warning lights. Pedestrian traffic. As per legislation, an employer must ensure, if reasonably practical, that walkways are designated to separate pedestrians from areas where power wheel is operating. We try. It's hard. But again, we don't have a ton of equipment or a ton of people. And as long as we all look out for each other, it works out pretty good. Probably one of the worst places is the door to the panel shop in Building 2, because the racks are right there, and the shit's 30 feet in the air, and people try to come in and out of that door. It's a blind spot. Everybody needs to be mindful of what could be happening. Frankly, if we're using the forklift there, we should be riveting off the door so people aren't coming out. There's also the hallway in front of Valley's office that people can... It has a sign on the floor that's usually half worn off. Well, that doesn't mean people are paying attention. But again, if forklifts are there, they're probably going pretty slow. They can't move very fast because of all the passovers for the cables you guys have anyway. But still, just things to be mindful of. That's probably one of the most congested. It's a walkway until it has a forklift in it, which is kind of backwards, but whatever. So just be mindful of that if you are running a forklift in a building. Obviously, you're not going to be going very fast, and people should be able to tell you're there. But it's another reason we don't get headphones and stuff, because we don't want people, not being able to hear the forklifts running. If it's not reasonably practical to use designated walkways for pedestrian traffic, an employer must ensure that safe work procedures are implemented to protect workers who enter areas where power build-up is in operation. Most forklift incidents occur when the operator is not paying attention to those working around them. Use particular caution when traveling in reverse and without outward swing of the forklift. When crossing uneven surfaces, approach all uneven surfaces slowly and safely. Stop and look both ways. Cross railway tracks at an angle rather than perpendicular. So instead of just going straight across them, hit them at an angle. That way only one tire is being affected by the bump at a time, and it keeps the forklift more level. If you go straight on, two tires are going to go in the dip at the same time, which might cause you to lose your load. You also got to go nice and slow so nothing gets shaken too violently. Know the hazardous material you work with. WMIS training and understanding the SDS or safety data sheets is essential. Where appropriate, PPE is your last line of defense. Exhaust gases produced by forklifts can be hazardous in confined space and ensure proper ventilation. Forklifts perform a vital function for production in the workplace. Without them, goods would not be moved and transported to potential customers. Throughout this course, you've learned the theory for operating forklifts safely. It's important you understand legislation and company policies and procedures regarding forklift use in the workplace. As an operator, it's important to understand and follow safe startup, operating, and shutdown procedures. Capacity and stability are also major factors, and operators need to consider and understand when lifting and transporting goods. Be a safe forklift operator. Yay! Participants will now take turns completing the obstacle course. So we're going to do the obstacle course. Shit, it's only 10:30. This thing always goes faster than I expect. We'll probably do the obstacle course after lunch. I haven't got one set up yet. I never know where I'm going to do it. And I never know what forklift I'm going to use because it all depends on what happens that day. That being said, we're going to do the written test first. And when you start the test, I have to go upstairs and print off the course evaluation forms. You all get to rate me and judge me and tell me how bad I did so I can prove to the people who sign off on this course that I actually did the course. In saying that, I will hand out your tests right now. So this